Over the next 45 minutes, we will hear from Canadian and U.S. experts on the impact of marijuana legalization and what it means for all Canadians. For Canadian business, some of the impacts include risk mitigation, potentially higher insurance costs, and employee-employer rights. The new regulatory regime will also have a great impact on various levels of government. And of course, it'll be important how they coordinate their policies and regulations. Other issues affecting Canadians include issues like public safety, mental health strategies, and operational issues related to production, distribution, and product labeling. Earlier today, the government's task force released its report, which included over 80 recommendations. Some of the recommendations generating the greatest amount of buzz in media and on social media include the recommendation for a minimum age to purchase marijuana to be 18. Possession limits, 30 grams for an individual. Sales restrictions, for example, having them not near schools. Advertising restrictions, including limits on advertising and discouraging the use by young people. Of course, there's also issues related to taxes, and there is a recommendation for higher taxes for higher THC content. And of course, how will governments use taxes? One of the recommendations is that the tax revenue should go towards public education campaigns and further research.
I think one of the things that's emerged as the discussion moves from the high level of kind of quasi-philosophic issues like social license, whether we're looking at this from as a criminal justice issue or a public health issue, is that as we get more granular on it, it's a deeply complex challenge. There's not a lot of precedents to go on. We really are breaking new ground here. And a lot of the issues, the policy issues, have a governance dimension, roles and responsibilities, who's going to do what and who's going to decide what. And I think it's particularly important for us to remember that we in Canada are in a federal state, and that the role of the provinces is going to loom very, very large here, and that issues of harmonization and decision-making and the extent of that will loom very large. And I think one of the central things that we're going to find as we go forward is how underdeveloped really the machinery of this is, and that we're going to have that going forward. So,
with alcohol, it's easy to use a breathalyzer, and the science supports using different thresholds. We don't have that for cannabis. That said, there are per se limits in Colorado and Washington, but they weren't a part of the initiative that was passed in California. So we have a lot more to learn about this, and it gets back to that issue that even if you have THC in your blood, it doesn't mean you're impaired. So there will need to be more research on this. With respect to price, as I said, price is not only going to influence what happens to the black market, but also revenues and what happens to consumption. And jurisdictions so if over time, if there's a reduction in the production and distribution costs from legalization, which we would expect to happen, then you can make decisions about whether or not you want to raise those prices, either by taxes, a minimum price, limiting production. And so I think that's going to be an important piece to the conversations at the federal and at the provincial level about what they're going to do about price. It's not a binary decision whether or not to legalize, and I've identified 10 of these design considerations that are really going to shape how marijuana legalization plays out, and they all conveniently begin with the letter P, and usually we could spend 45 minutes talking about all of these, but I just want to kind of give you a quick overview. First of all, the first P is production. The decisions you make about how much can be produced, what can be produced, that's going to have serious implications for the economy, and actually what ends up happening with public health. The second choice you have is with respect to profit motive. Are you going to allow for-profit companies to get involved? And we'll come back to this one in a moment. The third P is promotion. Are you going to allow it? And if so, is it going to be regulated? The fourth P you need to think about is prevention and treatment. And are you going to devote resources to developing new prevention messages? And if so, when will those prevention messages hit the streets? Will it be before the stores open or afterwards? The fifth design consideration is with policing and enforcement. Jurisdictions are going to have to make some tough decisions about what resources they want to dedicate to shutting down the black market. Related to that is the sixth P, that would be the penalties. What are the penalties going to be for driving under the influence? What are you going to do for those who are under 18 who get caught? Will it just be a civil infraction? Will it be a criminal offense? And this is especially important when you begin thinking about production. If someone is growing and selling illegally, is it just going to be a fine, or is it going to be a criminal offense? The seventh P is potency. I mean, there are dozens of cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. The one that gets the most attention is THC. One of the questions for jurisdictions is whether or not they want to put a threshold or a cap on the amount of THC that can be sold in products. Related to that is the eighth P, which is purity. Jurisdictions are also going to have to make decisions about the levels of pesticides and what other products could be actually sold with marijuana. For example, are you going to allow flavored products? The ninth P is price, and this is important because for a number of reasons we would expect that the retail price over time to go down after legalization. And price is important not only because it influences the size of the black market, it also has implications for obviously tax revenues and also what happens to consumption. And the last P is permanency. Since no jurisdictions have really kind of gone down this path, and we can't kind of look at the literature on this or the evidence, you can imagine that it'd be smart for jurisdictions to build in flexibility. As we get more information, you'd want to build that in. And in fact, some jurisdictions may even want to think about building in a sunset clause. That is, maybe they'll try an alternative to prohibition for a certain number of years, and then at the end of that specified time period, they could decide whether or not to continue with that approach or try something else.
And since January 1st to just on Sunday this week, there were 190,000 tweets issued by Canadians. In all, 82,000 Canadians tweeted about issues related to marijuana. Now, it wasn't always Canadian-specific policies. For example, there was a spike on November 8th and November 9th that tied to the election, the United States election. But there are other spikes, of course. April 20th is the 420, so there are 5,000 tweets on that particular day. And February 24th, there was the announcement about the court decision to allow medical marijuana patients to grow their own marijuana. So this final slide that I'm going to share compares what the public is talking about versus what MPs are talking about over the now, it's a slightly different period because I wanted to make sure we had enough content to look at from the MPs. So we're looking at 90 days from the public and this calendar year from MPs. And the conversation has not really gotten heavily substantial yet. What we're seeing is people talking more about the concept of legalizing marijuana. We see that there's the medical marijuana issue, which has been a longstanding, this is an issue that dates back several years, that the legalization of marijuana has really only been a forefront conversation. We're starting to become a forefront conversation in this calendar year since the last federal election. So we're seeing the discussions about medical use, the legalization of marijuana, recreational use of marijuana, which somewhat ties to 420 as well. We're seeing discussion about health impacts that typically hinge around brain development in young people. And we're seeing discussion about key participants. So Bill Blair, we're seeing Anne McClellan, Jane Philpott, and the Prime Minister Trudeau as well. And what's interesting is we're seeing a slight reshuffling of those same top 5 issues among the MPs, so we really haven't seen the substantive conversation. Again, I expect that we're going to see a shift in that today with the release of the report, which brings to the forefront a number of key issues and key issues that Dan has brought up in this discussion as well, which include insurability in the workplace, private insurance, public safety, workplace safety, et cetera.